Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And a lot of news we have, starting this morning with a threat from Turkish President Erdogan to block Finland and Sweden from joining NATO. What will that mean just days after Finland and Sweden are indicating they want to join the alliance? We have different views of Europe between Vladimir Putin and French President Emmanuel Macron. We have a crisis brewing in Northern Ireland, where Sinn Fein won a new election, and there is a question of whether the relationship between Northern Ireland, the mainland, the main island, the United Kingdom, and the EU will be resolved. And finally, we're going to look at where globalization is heading as trade relations seem to be becoming more and more difficult. So lots of things for us to talk about it here this week. Joining us for the first time, Caroline de Gruyter, who is the senior correspondent and columnist for NRC Handelsblad in the Netherlands, although she's joining us from Brussels. Caroline, great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
From London, James Harding, founder and editor-in-chief of Tortoise Media. James, great to have you back.
Good to see you, Eva.
And from New York, Ryan Heath, senior editor at Politico and author of a Global Insider newsletter and podcast. Ryan, great to have you.
Hi, everyone.
Caroline, let's start with you. There's a lot happening on the front of NATO and with countries wanting to join an alliance that Vladimir Putin blames for the war in Ukraine. Countries indicating that perhaps not so quick in terms of the alliance, but yet others wanting to join. There's a lot happening here. Can you help us unpack where we are?
Well, I think what we see now is that neutral countries in Europe, militarily neutral countries in Europe, are scrambling for cover. They're feeling exposed by the war in Ukraine, and they are trying to add one life insurance on top of another, I think. So what we see is Finland and Sweden, as you said already, have indicated they will seek membership of NATO, which 2 months ago majorities in those countries and most political parties didn't want. And it's completely turned because of the war. They feel, especially Finland, feels directly threatened. But we also see different moves. A little bit is less spectacular, but moves nevertheless. We see Denmark, that had always put its cards on NATO alone and never wanted to have anything to do with EU defense and security initiatives. So it has an opt-out even. It's trying to undo that opt-out. It's organizing a referendum. So it tries to add an additional layer as well. Then we have Switzerland and Austria, which are, of course, feeling a little bit less insecure because they're less directly exposed. Although I've lived in Vienna and I've noticed there that the border with Ukraine is closer to Vienna than the border with Switzerland. But they've always been neutral as well, and Austria under threat from Moscow even. Since the 1950s, and they are both now discussing getting, the neutrality principle. Is it still valid? Switzerland has quite a strong army, but it's not close to NATO at all, and it cannot defend itself. Austria doesn't have an army to speak of. And the generals are even admitting it themselves. So yes, there's a lot happening, and I think this sort of, in a way, also blends the EU and NATO closer together. Yes, and so Turkey if Turkey would object to Finland and Sweden to become members. I think the question we should ask is what is Turkey's price? Usually, we've seen that with the refugees in 2015. They wanted a lot of money. Let's see what they want now. The other thing we can throw in is Brexit, I think. Boris Johnson has offered Finland and Sweden security guarantees. What has he asked for in return? So there's a lot happening, and everything is getting connected to everything. All kinds of difficult dossiers are being thrown in the same pot, which makes it complicated. At the same time, because there's so much there, one can be tied to another.
Yeah, I think, Caroline, I think you really are explaining how everything is linked. I think we have gotten used in the past 2 months that Ukraine drives everything, and it does. That's the main motor of change. But then there's so many other things that are starting to play. Intriguingly, this Brexit link, which we'll come back to. What is Boris Johnson trying to do here with, unilateral security guarantees to Sweden and Finland? That's a big deal in normal case. Now, hopefully, NATO will do the rest, right? It will come there. But Ryan, when you look at this tableau, how do you see the relationship between sort of NATO and the European Union being changed in front of us? It used to be NATO does security, the European Union does economics, but now that we are in a case of economic warfare with regard to Russia, and the EU is the principal instrument for this, are we seeing emerging here of these institutions and trying to sort out who is going to be where and how it's going to evolve, and that's part of what the Turks are worried about?
I wouldn't call it emerging, but it's a Venn diagram that is becoming a bigger and bigger overlap. And I'm honestly not surprised by that. The rise of cyber as a hybrid threat has effectively been blurring those boundaries and pushing the two institutions together. And I guess it is all in the zone of the post-2014 invasion of Crimea, but you've seen a lot of overlap structurally in terms of NATO consulting or appearing at EU summits for the last few years. And now the war acts as an accelerant to that. And I just think we're going to see more of it. And we shouldn't be surprised if NATO sort of does expand in new and interesting ways. We talk about Switzerland or Austria not really being able to defend themselves. Well, Iceland doesn't even have an army, and it's in NATO. So NATO membership obviously is not guaranteed for any country that wants to be a part of it, but different countries bring different things to the table, and just having a big army isn't the qualifying criteria, and having a big army won't necessarily get you in the front door. And then to respond to Caroline's point about what would Turkey's price be, Erdogan is facing a huge amount of heat at the moment over Turkey's refugee population, which is more than 4 million out of 84 million, most of them Syrian, but hundreds of thousands of Afghans as well. And the main opposition party there has a new policy to send Syrians back to Syria. And Erdogan has to respond to that, and has been responding to that. And I think money and support will be among the list of prices that he charges for Sweden and Finland coming into the alliance.
James, I want you to talk a little bit about Turkey and whether we're entering the souk here in terms of what the deal is in part, but I also really want to get your view on what's happening in London, because as the EU and NATO cooperate more closely, as both Caroline and Ryan said, it becomes distinctly uncomfortable for London, which has left the EU, to figure out how it's going to maneuver. And how do you see that?
So there are, I think, kind of three really big and different ideas that we've already touched on. I think Caroline's completely right to talk about the end of neutrality. That's a colossal shift. No one a year ago would have thought that you were seeing Switzerland changing its neutrality on finance, Germany and Japan on military, Finland and Sweden. We're seeing a massive change, and that's a change from majority positions in terms of the populations of those countries. I think that we're seeing a big move in terms of a blurred responsibility amongst the organizations of Europe. So exactly as you were suggesting, Ivo, the economics and the military and the security requirements were historically divided between NATO and the EU. And then there was an understanding a muddled one, but an understanding that somehow the EU was going to take some responsibilities for issues of foreign policy. This is much, much more blurred than it's ever been before. And then in steps Macron this week with a speech that says, hang on, there's a new idea here. We've got an idea of a political community. So I think we've got security, economics, and politics that are being reconfigured in Europe. I would say one thing about the Erdogan intervention on Finland and Sweden, which is it's very quick and easy to say, look, it's an Erdogan problem. And I'm as confused as anyone by the fact that NATO hadn't managed to square away Erdogan before they were making these overtures to Finland and Sweden. But the problem that Erdogan will raise for NATO member countries is that I think people will start asking themselves, well, if we're prepared to defend Finland and Sweden, why not Ukraine? Or vice versa, if we're not prepared to step in militarily on Ukraine, do we want to be on the hook for the exposure to Finland and Sweden? And so what seemed inevitable is suddenly going to get open to debate. And I wouldn't be surprised if you were in a conversation in Chicago or in London, people will begin suddenly to stop and say, is this such a good idea? Or vice versa, isn't it an argument for military engagement in Ukraine itself? London, in all of this, of course, you have to counter for the, sort of acknowledge the role of Boris Johnson in this. If you were Finland and Sweden, given what the EU has experienced on international treaties with the Brits recently, you possibly wouldn't bank your future on a security guarantee from the UK from Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. It breaks my heart to say that, but that would be a kind of act of realism. That said, I think there is a really, really interesting difference between Johnson and Macron in this. Macron is engaged diplomatically, Johnson is engaged politically, and they're very different.
Fascinating. That difference, and I think the three trends you're mentioning are exactly right. Caroline, James mentioned the Macron speech and the Macron real challenge, which I think is also trying to not only promote Europe and Europeanism in some ways, or French, maybe it's Frenchism, good old fashioned Gaullism, in some ways. But he can't help himself in contrasting Europe with the transatlantic alliance, right? And yet there is this different trend. So how do you see it? Major speech, just to set the stage, major speech on May 9th, the same day that Vladimir Putin gave his major speech on how he saw the world, looking at the political structure of Europe. Tell us a little bit about what they said, and then what does it all mean?
Yeah, good question. I think expectations of Putin's speech were rather high, too high. I think even Gattas called it a nothing burger already last week. She was right. It was a nothing burger. Yeah, what did he say? It was a bitter speech. I think he was rather hysterical again about Nazis everywhere. He portrayed Russia again as a victim. NATO, the West are the aggressors, and they're using Ukraine to get at us. That kind of thing. I mean, bigger. The contrast with Macron's speech could not have been bigger. Putin was talking about the past, basically, Nazis and undoing all kinds of things that happened in the past that he doesn't like. While Macron was trying to look into the future. Putin's world is autocracy based on raw power as well. And Macron was talking about a stronger Europe in the future and sharing more power, even with citizens. So that was quite a strong contrast. I think Europe right now is experiencing the same thing. It has happened many times before, which is that many countries are knocking on the door seeking shelter from Russia. It happened during the Cold War, right, in the 1950s. That's why European integration started in the first place, remember, as a bulwark against communist totalitarianism. It happened in the 1990s as well. after the fall of the wall, where many Central and Eastern European countries ran away from Moscow at the first opportunity. And now it happens again. You know, the Western Balkans are there. They had been there, but with more urgency now too. Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova has asked for membership. So we get the same old debate as we always had before. Everybody understands that the knocking on the door, but many member states have doubts because the EU is not ready. The EU is never ready. France is the only one ever that has grandes idées in Europe, always. So Macron, being very French, he says what the French always say: let's first reform Europe and then enlarge it. So first, otherwise we get stuck with our decision making. It's already difficult with 27. It's even going to be more difficult with new countries, even more. So, and meanwhile, he said, let's offer Ukraine a sort of associated membership in a way. It's not a real membership because that will take 10 or 15 years at least. But they can have some goodies already, also for and some symbolism. And for Europe, he wants to do away with the veto. And he proposed a Europe of several speeds. So a small group goes faster, hardcore integrates more and integrates faster. And then you have the others who follow or not at different speeds. It's an old idea. And nobody wants to be downgraded to second-class member states. So I predict it will not
David
fly.
Cameron would have taken that offer had it been on the table.
Totally, right, completely.
Well, no, you can also argue that Europe is already a multi-speed Europe. Some have the euro, others don't. Some have Schengen, others don't. I mean, there's a lot of some non-EU members are in Schengen. I lived in Norway too, which is in Schengen, and is sharing in healthcare policy during COVID and so on. You would be surprised. I mean, it's very difficult to understand, but I don't think they will officialize it. What you could see at the moment is even if 1/3 of Macron's plans ever materialize, I think Putin unites Europeans at the moment. We have a common threat in a way. People are still not happy with the EU and the way it works, and hence we always go around in circles and change things, but never as planned, never as, coming out of a grand speech by Macron. So people are not very happy with the EU, but I think they're much more happy than before in the EU. Even the populists don't want to go out anymore. And this is what the war in Ukraine and what Putin are doing in Europe at the moment. I think it's a major development.
Yeah, no, I think, Caroline, I think that's exactly right. The sense of an external threat is unifying, and and I think everybody is trying in one form or another, Ryan, to sort of respond to that, and they're doing it, and they're trying to get the best price. And I think that's what the Erdogan is saying. By the way, also saying, wait a minute, weren't we supposed to be the next in line for European Union membership? Whatever happened to that one? I mean, so they're playing their own politics, but there is this unifying sense that there's a limit on how far you can break this up, and the French are, multi-speed Europe. I think I heard that sometime in the 70s for the first time. So it's been
German
around.
Idea.
A German idea, which of course by definition now is no longer German. Ryan, just a few comments on this.
Well, I would say even if it's not multi-speed Europe officially, coalitions of the willing have been developing in different forms in recent years. We saw it with different tax deals, different approaches to budgets. I honestly don't understand why it's not happening around a Russian oil embargo. Sovereign governments can do whatever the hell they want. And if 26 EU countries wanted to do this embargo now, they could come to some legal arrangement together, regardless of whether that was officially an EU policy or not. I can see why people want to go the extra mile and get Hungary in the door, but I don't see what the problem is. You know, like if the challenge the EU has at one level is demonstrating benefits to keep an engaged population, then coalitions of the willing are a way to get there. And I think we just have to be willing to accept that if we want a European Union to not just survive, but to thrive, which I think most rational people would say is important when you look at all of the geopolitics of the world at the moment.
James, let me shift over to another big news: local elections in the UK, with a very important result in Northern Ireland, where Sinn Fein has become the largest party for the first time. Explain how that happened, because it's a part not just because people wanted to be pro Sinn Fein, it's also that the unionist vote didn't go, was split in ways that it hadn't been for a while. But it links in directly into the growing debate within London and Westminster about the relationship between the EU, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the and the mainland. That really is raising profound questions about the union itself on the one hand, and on the other, the relationship between London and Brussels on the other, given how Brexit proceeded. Help us understand what's happening, and where do you think this is really leading?
I'd love to. I'll try, Ivo. I'll try. This one is a really messy one. I'll just say one thing as a kind of footnote to the conversation about the EU and EU unity, just to, I think, a really important point. The West didn't step in and provide a no-fly zone in Ukraine. There are going to be real questions for people about whether the West has done enough. And I just sort of flag up the Zelensky call this week to secure the port of Odessa. We are going to be talking about food prices and migration and, you know, riots and potentially famine into 2023. And we're going to come back and we're going to think to ourselves, did we really talk enough about or think enough about Western efforts to secure the port of Odessa? I just think, just in response, Caroline, to your point about a kind of European unity, I worry that it's more kind of rhetorical than physical or than actual, but that's just a bugbear of mine. Okay. To Ireland.
No, but I mean, but just on this, I just want to highlight, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And it is remarkable that there's been very little debate about how do you get full grain silos. They're full, completely full, near the Odessa port. I've actually started to talk to people in Washington of reminding them about the tanker escorts that we had in the late 1980s when the Iranians were bombing oil tankers coming out of Iraq and mining the Gulf, and then we sent in warships, including anti-mine ships, in order to protect these tankers as they were coming out of the Gulf. There's nothing to prevent us from doing the same thing with grain from the Black Sea, with one exception. The Turks need to open up the Bosporus Straits in order to allow non-resident Navy ships to come in, which is a big issue. So that may be another price that we need to pay in.
Ivo, just out of interest, though, that was that was what the
in the late 1980s. The U.S. It was a coalition of the willing. I mean, it turned out that the Dutch and Belgian navies had the best minesweeping capabilities, so they were part of it. I'm pretty sure the UK and the French were part of it, but the US, this was the Reagan administration and went into the Bush administration. Remember, it's when they shot down the civilian airliner, thinking it was an Iranian airplane that was attacking a US ship. All of that was happening, but it was protecting oil tankers through the Persian Gulf that were being attacked by and mined by Iranian regular and irregular forces that were then protected. So you have this precedent from 30 years ago that a essential commodity was protected in this wasn't a war zone, because it may have been, no, it probably was during the Iran-Iraq war, at the end of the Iran-Iraq war.
It's interesting because I was talking to David Beasley at the World Food Programme, and I was trying to find a precedent for coalition of the willing military intervention to protect food supply lines. And
so this is oil, but it's a critical commodity, and you could argue it's a critical commodity as the example. Caroline, you wanted to jump in on this?
Well, Iran at the time was not a nuclear power. I think this is the difference.
Yeah.
Well, that's true, and you know, you're absolutely right.
Big difference.
Yeah.
If Russia was not a nuclear power, this entire story, we wouldn't have this discussion now.
Yeah.
I think.
No, I agree with that. But remember that the rest of the world recognizes Ukrainian territorial waters as Ukrainian, and certainly Odessa, which by the way, the Russians haven't claimed yet. That the Black Sea is an international waterway, and that therefore, at the invitation of the Ukrainians, having ships doesn't need to be interfered with the Russians. It's the Russians would have to interfere with those ships.
Exactly. Okay.
So it puts the onus of escalation, frankly, on the Russians, not necessarily on the coalition of the willing, whichever coalition that is.
Just Ivo, out of interest, what's the reception to that idea in Washington?
Caroline's, there's six submarines in the Black Sea, and it's really hard. And you know, are you willing to confront the Russians over it? And oh, by the way, how are you going to get the Turks to do this? But I think the argument you're making that this is going to be an issue sooner rather than later, unless you can find other ways to get the grain out, which is what the EU is now working on through railways and trucks. Yeah, but you're not going to be able to do it at the level that you need.
The ships, they can't, like the numbers just don't stack up. It's like the trucks can do 1/100 of what the ships can do, and the trains can do 1/10 of what the ships can do. So stuff will be left in the silos or in the ground if the port isn't accessible.
Yeah, and that's the other part of the food crisis, right? Which is that the silos are full. So when you actually turns out the agricultural results for this year from Ukraine are pretty good, but you can't actually take whatever it is you have on the ground because you can't store it anywhere because the silos are full. So it's a real catch-27 and maybe catch-22 actually. That gets you.
It has 28 members. It's a catch-28.
James, back to you. But thanks for bringing it up. Thanks for bringing it up because it's an important issue.
I think it is. Although you may just think it was a very elegant attempt to try and get out of trying to, unravel the.
Yeah, but that's not succeeding. You still have 15 minutes, so you.
Okay, so I'll give this a go. I think the most important thing and the simplest thing, if you're new to the whole issue, is that the United Kingdom post-Brexit is now a country in which the most popular parties in both Belfast and Edinburgh are seeking referendums on a vote to leave the United Kingdom. So those referendums are not going to be granted by this existing government, by Boris Johnson's government, but the success of Sinn Fein in Northern Ireland is a fundamental change in the politics of the island of Ireland, because what Sinn Fein has successfully done is moved from being, and everyone will sort of know the name Sinn Fein and think, oh yes, that's the political wing of the IRA. Sinn Fein has become a very successful political operation, largely by being really focused on cost of living issues in Northern Ireland. It's fundamentally a proposition about how do we change people's lives in Northern Ireland, and hasn't engaged as much in what's known as the border poll, the question of the referendum. The issue is that the unionists, those people who want to remain part of the United Kingdom, have themselves been torn apart by Brexit, because as part of Brexit, the deal that the UK did was what's known as the Northern Ireland Protocol, which in its simplest terms is like putting a border in the Irish Sea, i.e. rather than putting a border across between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, you put a border in the sea. The unionists feel that this means that the terms of trade, right, between them and the rest of the three nations of the United Kingdom are different. And that means that they are being downgraded in their membership of the United Kingdom. And fundamentally, they won't play ball with Sinn Fein and join the new government. So there is an effective choice here, which is you can have an executive government in Belfast, or you can have the protocol, the Northern Ireland Protocol. One or the other is going to get blocked. And the unionists say, let's block the protocol. The UK government in Westminster says, okay, fine, let's block the protocol. And that means that in Brussels, they're saying, hang on, we just negotiated this deal so that we can secure, in effect, the borders of our customs union. And now you want to rip that up. And if you're going to do that, we'll retaliate. And so while Caroline is right to say there's a kind of greater unity amongst Europeans, I think there is certainly not greater unity between Britain and the European Union. In fact, in the ridiculously bonkers world we live in, we could be tipping into a trade war with everything else that's going on. And by the way, inflation knocking on 8% in this country and a potential recession in the second half of the year, a trade war between the UK and the European Union. And if, by the way, at the end of all of that, you feel a little bit like Kevin Kline in A Fish Called Wanda, and today I can't remember the middle bit, I completely understand.
So, I mean, the other way to look at it, James, is in some ways what's playing out in this part of the world is the very nationalism that Putin is appealing to for his worldview that we saw on display, and Caroline reminded us on display on May 9th. That and this, in case, is not British or even United Kingdom nationalism. No, it's Irish nationalism versus English nationalism versus Scottish nationalism.
And to touch on the point, I know you'll come to this with Ryan in a moment, but to touch on the idea of deglobalization, we talk about deglobalization sort of instinctively as an idea that is East versus West, US versus China. But actually what you're doing is seeing that at a level that is, if you like, lower, much closer to home.
Yeah, and I'll come to you, Ryan, in a minute. But I wanted, Caroline, you're a close observer of how Brussels is reacting to this, and you know, if we've learned anything in the Brexit saga, is that counting on disunity in Europe in order on the British question is not a good idea. The Europeans are pretty darn united on this issue, even if they're not necessarily on. And so, what's the mood in Brussels as they, you know, we're on the verge, I guess, of an introduction of a law in Westminster to overhaul the Irish Protocol, the deal, which basically the deal between the UK and the EU, allowing the UK to leave.
I think everybody's pretty fed up with this story here in Brussels since a long time already. At the same time, many people are feeling that the real Brexit is only starting now. I think for a long time, many people, not Brussels, just Brussels, but also in the capitals and also in friendly capitals, let's be frank, like The Hague. People who really wanted to help the UK with the soft Brexit landing, they completely have it as well. And so the feeling for a long time, but many people have had the feeling for a long time that the UK has signed this protocol just in order to be, you know, to get Brexit over the line and then rip it up later. And this is exactly what is happening. Because the protocol, I mean, this is all about the internal market, protecting the internal market. So there has to be a border somewhere. And since nobody wanted to have the border on the island of Ireland to endanger peace, it was put between the UK and Northern Ireland. So for that, the UK didn't want to have customs officers there. So they said, we will do it. But they never did anything. The documents were not ready, so companies didn't know what to do. It was complete chaos. They said they would allow all kinds of EU officers in the ports. That was never facilitated either. They never got access to all kinds of systems. So for a long time in Brussels, they have understood like, the UK doesn't want to make this work. So it is, an explosion in slow motion in a way. Yeah. And it's not going to be, I think everybody's pretty united on this. How it continues, that remains to be seen, because I think what we will see now, just briefly, is there's a hole. If the UK, as it now announced, will stop checking goods coming into the single market, the European single market, into Northern Ireland, I mean, nice people everywhere in the world can use that leak, and just, there will be a scandal one day or another, and then the EU will be forced to check, to control its outside borders, and it will put Ireland on the spot. We've been very nice protecting Ireland all the time, and it's irritated the UK not a little bit. But now we will see, at some point we will have to put pressure on Ireland and say either the customs checks will be done on the island, so there will be a border with Northern Ireland. The Irish will hate that. Or we put the checks between Ireland and the EU. And I think London can't wait to have this battle, to see this battle being fought out.
Talk about nationalism and those kinds of issues. And Ryan, comment if you want on the specifics of this, but it's part of a larger issue. Is that for 30 years plus, we have thought that the efficient way of economic interaction is to ignore political borders.
Yeah,
and that's kind of coming to an end. Even if it wasn't always like that, it really is no longer the case that political borders, and the Ireland EU-UK issue is just a microcosm, I think, as James rightly said, of this larger reality that geopolitics and politics is again starting to interfere with economics, and thus with trade and everything else.
Yeah, and one reason I think the British won't get away with what they want in this particular case is it's kind of an attempt at British exceptionalism, which maybe works if, like America, you have the reserve currency and the biggest military and in all the moral authority that went around World War II. But when you're the small player in the argument, in the end, it doesn't work. So I don't know the way in which it's going to fall apart for the Brits, but it's just very strongly my sense that it will. And it does. This is like a great sort of bridge or segue into this point about where globalization is going. I think COVID and now the war in Russia to some extent disguises some geoeconomic realities, maybe is the term I would apply to this situation with globalization. So in the case of Brexit, we haven't really seen real Brexit yet, because you've had all of these other extraordinary events just mixing everything up and masking it. And now real Brexit will be felt sort of from here on in. It's not the end of globalization, any of this, but it is certainly a globalization punctuated by lots of different disruptions. Trade is not ending, but we're going to see radically different supply chains. We are going to see different or no trade deals and fewer assumptions, like you said, about the primacy of commerce over these other political considerations. So we're still going to be very interconnected. Like the internet alone ensures that is the case, even though that itself is also fragmenting in different ways. But it's just there's going to be a lot more friction in the process, and people have more questions. Populations are not going to go along for the ride and trust their elites to just sign away different rights and different ways of producing and living. So it's going to get more complicated. And really good example of that is coming to a head right now in Washington, where Joe Biden has invited the leaders of ASEAN, the Southeast Asian club. And he is not only not willing to join any of the new functioning trade deals that exist, that they're a part of, but he wants to have a new Indo-Pacific economic framework, but it's not really clear what benefits that would deliver. He's not really willing to announce it while all these leaders have come to Washington. He's going to save that up for a trip to Japan in 2 weeks' time. It just feels very jumbled and very not the forward movement of globalization that we knew and some people loved in previous decades.
Yeah, and James, coming to you in a second. I mean, just to underscore, what's driving Biden's unwillingness to join the reforms TTP or even to announce this thing is domestic politics. It's the reality that globalization is a dirty word. In fact, it's now called globalism. by certain people, and in part because of the impact. And it's not just Donald Trump, by the way. This is widespread. After all, this is Joe Biden who's president right now, and he's not pushing the trade agenda in a way that all of his predecessors, except for Donald Trump, did for 70 years. And that's the real change here. James, jump in.
I just wanted to give an example. You may not have noticed it this week because it was a little bit in the business pages, but there's a story around HSBC, one of the world's biggest banks. When I was the Shanghai correspondent of the FT in the late 90s, we get to do an amazing story about the bank on the Bund, HSBC's, which was this kind of gilded, exquisite place full of kind of old lock boxes that had been boarded up post the 1949 revolution. And it was symbolic of a world that was reopening. This was, just a couple of years after Deng Xiaoping and the reform and opening up of China. This week, what you're seeing is real pressure on HSBC from now its largest shareholder, Ping An, the insurance company, which ironically they originally invested in. But Ping An is saying, look, you should break up HSBC and you should break it up into an Asian bank that essentially can be nice with Beijing, and a Western bank, a European bank, that's going to be on the right side of Washington. And so what you're seeing is, even before you get to, if you like, the real kind of geopolitics of rewriting the rules of the economy, you're seeing institutions preparing for a world in which essentially East and West is divided, and we have very separate marketplaces with rules governed by political values. Mm-hmm. I think it's extraordinary. It's not clear what happens, but HSBC for me is one of those cases that you've got to keep an eye on.
I think it's a great story about the fissures and how business is trying to, but for 30 years has been told, go out and do whatever you want and make money, is now being told, hey, maybe not. And not all businesses are getting the message. So I was struck that the CEO of Volkswagen pleaded for an end to the war. And if only the Ukrainians would just negotiate like their sovereignty so we could go back to trading, because trade is the future. I don't think the Ukrainians took that very seriously. Frankly, I'm not sure even the German government took that very seriously. And the change is palpable in the way, and perhaps we can end here, Caroline, with there's a meeting on Monday of the Trade and Technology Council between the EU and the United States, with Antony Blinken and Gina Raimondo and Catherine Tai on the U.S. side, and the EU on the other side, to really try to create an economic bloc. I mean, that's, I think, fundamentally what it means. By the way, interestingly enough, the UK wasn't invited to be part of this today. Maybe down the road, they can then sign up to whatever agreements the US and the EU have negotiated. To Ryan's point, they may not be big enough in some ways to matter.
Yes, well, Brexit was not our idea. I think it was the UK's idea. So if you don't want to have anything to do with the EU, then you are not invited, perhaps. But what you see more and more is also all kinds of holy cows are slaughtered in Europe too, because of the war in Ukraine. We always said protectionism is bad and it leads to war and conflict and so on. But this is also now what we're doing. We're setting up an industrialization policy so we get more production of medicine, of all kinds of stuff in Europe itself, because we're too vulnerable buying it from the rest of the world. So this is also one of the issues to be discussed next week. I think what you see is a little bit more of the West versus the rest, and I don't like it that much. It's probably smart policy at the moment, but it will force the rest of the world also push them into the field of Russia, which is not necessarily a good thing.
I think that if this ends up in the rest, yes, the West versus the rest, the question is good. How much of the rest is going to join the West, and the next competition is for Africa, for South Asia, Southeast Asia, and of course for Latin America, where
They
all
don't
of
want
this
to
is,
make that choice.
no, they want to sit on the fence. But if the fence gets high enough, at some point they fall off. And so the question is, which side will they fall off? Ryan, last word to you.
Ivo, if you're not on the fence, that's the other problem. Next thing I'm writing about is the digital yuan, China's central bank-backed digital currency, which obviously is rolling out much quicker than any move in the US. They haven't even decided that they want one. They're building a blockchain backbone that any of the 100 other countries piloting their own currencies could build onto. They will think about baking it into Belt and Road contracts. They will use it for OPEC country oil agreements. And the US isn't really there at the moment. And it doesn't mean that people are going to gravitate automatically to what China is doing here, because the US has deep and liquid capital markets. It has rule of law. It has a lot of other advantages, but the US isn't even in the game when it comes to these digital currencies at the moment. And that the fact that that is not really even being thought through properly or quickly enough is something to think about.
We will think about it. We'll come back as soon as we understand really what the implication is for the United States, for the European Union and the euro, the pound sterling, and another edition of World Review. And in the meantime, I want to thank James Harding, Caroline de Gruyter, and Ryan Heath for your comments and your contributions. Great conversation. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. And until then, bye-bye and have a great weekend.
Thanks, Ivo.